I've been thinking of that in two ways. One is requiring that somebody who's in a minority represent the whole of that minority, which is absurd on the face of it, but it's such an easy error to fall into. And the second way I've been thinking about it is assuming that a person is the sum of their visible identity position is what I think of tokenism, the underlying logic of tokenism.
The reason why tokenism is such an issue into companies today is because when one or more individuals are different than the majority, according to past research, this leads to three consequences. These consequences are role entrapment, social isolation, and performance pressure. These components not only put a strain on their personal identity, but also the identity that they're forced to represent in the workplace.
Performance pressure. Not only having to worry about working well for yourself and your personal goals, but having to represent your community well. And the overwhelming feeling of not only working harder to get the same results as your counterparts because of lack of similar representation of thought or perspective. Social isolation. The feeling of isolation because of the inability to relate to the company's culture. Now, the company doesn't necessarily do this on purpose or with malintent, but because of the culture of the company, this unfortunately may tokenize the minority. Role entrapment. Being stuck in a position without hope of moving up or away because opportunities don't seem available, or when the characteristics of an individual are distorted to fit a stereotypical role. So, how does tokenism affect the company in the workplace? Well, for starters, it can lead to effects negatively in morale. It can lead to high rates of turnover for those people who are in those underrepresented communities and groups. And most pointedly, it deprives the organization of the full contribution for the people who are tokenized. And in and of itself, tokenism prevents the company from realizing its full potential or its full capability of growing and developing. So what are our solutions to this problem? Well, let's take a look.
One proposed solution to the issue of tokenism was created by Rosabeth Moss Kanter in 1977 and in her book, Men and Women of the Corporation. In this book, she talked about how the issue of tokenism could be solved by increasing the proportion of minority groups working in companies to above 15%. As she said, groups are more likely to have a negative experience in the workplace due to their low numerical representation.
So what that means is that she believed that combating tokenism and lack of diversity was simply done by incorporating more of the missing representation. And this makes sense, right? If you're lacking in something, the best way to combat it is to add more of it so it no longer is lacking or is less lacking. Think of it this way. If your doctor tells you that you're vitamin C deficient or that you don't eat enough vegetables, then what do they usually tell you after that? You should eat more vegetables. You should get more vitamin C in your diet and drink some orange juice. Well, before we look into the stipulations behind that, let's look into the pros and cons of Kanter's theory.
One of the pros of Kanter's theory is that as a proportion of the minority group in the business rises above 15%, it will cause that group to have more visibility within the corporate landscape. This in turn will reduce the amount of scrutinization that each individual employee receives due to the fact that there are more of them working in a broader range of roles and positions and improving the way they stand and appear within their business. Another pro of having increased minority representation in firms is that it helps to discourage homophily biases, which isolate tokens and encapsulate them in stereotypical roles. It is so important to fight homophily biases because they are the key driving force of tokenism.
First con to Kanter's theory is that it was written in 1977. Things like the iPhone and the internet did not exist. Similarly, an article now states that the 15% should now be 25%. Having 15% representation may make minorities more numerous, but this doesn't necessarily change the corporate culture to protect them or discourage discrimination. Using sheer numbers to address the issue of tokenism does not address it at its main source.
So Jad, for example, So looking into a real-life scenario, there was research that looked into a police force that did incorporate a higher percentage of women in the workplace. However, even with women representing more than 15% of the workplace, it was plagued with another issue: company culture and position perception. Many of the war stories or description of heroes talked about in the workplace of policemen only typically centered around physical aspects, where the policemen were great because of their physical stature as opposed to their mental and cognitive skills. This, even with the increase of representation, still poses an issue because the culture of the workplace still upholds the tokenization of the underrepresented. Police administrators needed to focus more on the similarities of male and female police officers, but it also expressed that the culture of the environment should de-emphasize the importance of physical stature and emphasize the significance of communication and strategy, because simply implementing more of the underrepresented doesn't solve the bigger issue. Let's bring up another example. Let's talk about India. A recent law required that at least one woman be admitted on all corporate boards in India. They argued that making women be on corporate boards created the opportunity for more women representation and employment, and also allowed for the reduction of tokenism. Now, these fell in line with Kantor's theory. However, they did forget to take into consideration one thing: cultural and societal support. So they felt as though this would require support from society, as even if there were more women placed in higher positions of authority, unless their views and voices, as well as influences, were placed on the same level and platform, then the majority influence would still take center stage. Now take a look at this graphic here. We see that the ambition of men and women are about the same, with a little bit more when it comes to women in India. However, there's low percentage rates of participation, especially as we move higher up in the positions of authority. This expresses that numbers alone is not the only solution, because if the culture and the society surrounding it doesn't support it, or if the voices of the underrepresented are not mutually exclusive to their quantitative presence, then it wouldn't even matter if the minority became the majority, as the influence wouldn't match up. So what do you think we're saying? Are we saying to completely scrap the whole idea of Kantor's theory? Well, not exactly, because Kantor's theory, as criticized by many others, was just viewed as too simplistic because numbers alone wouldn't change the fact that tokenism still occurs in the work environment. What we plan to do is to utilize Kantor's theory as the base or the foundation for our solution.
So when we look at our solution, we use it with the understanding that it is still necessary to have more representation of diversity in terms of quantity. With that, our solution is 3 big focuses. Number 1, with implementation, there should always be a focus on retention and inclusion. Number 2, there has to be curiosity in the breaking away from assuming. And finally, incorporating the idea of asking.
Diversity accelerates innovation. The more broadly any discipline or field or organization casts a net for talent, the more likely they are to bring divergent points of view, experiences, expertise.
Focus on retention and inclusion. Once there is diversity in the workplace, the culture in there must feel accommodating and welcome for those who are underrepresented. So there's a feeling of not only wanting to engage and do well there, but also the desire to stay there. This can be done by implementing task forces that specifically cater to ensuring that the work environment feels safe and implement activities that promote healthy collaboration and discussion. It can also be done by having companies recruit members of the organization that are committed to cultivating inclusion because it's about the community. Curiosity and the breaking away from assuming. When companies are curious about the viewpoints of the underrepresented, and when companies are genuine in their interest to seek out diversity of thought and perspective, it is seen within the company by the employees.
Because if you assume that you don't know about somebody, that they're worth listening to and exploring who they are, rather than starting with an assumption about who they are, you've broken down that first barrier of tokenism. You allow them the space to be all of the things that they bring in terms of their identity, not just the ones that are apparent to you.
And finally, the idea of asking. We'll let President Rowe take this one.
Like, what makes you feel you belong? That's why I say start with curiosity. Also, maybe I should say appreciative curiosity. Like, appreciate what you hear as an answer. When you start with a question, what makes you feel you belong, and you use the insights that you glean, you can change the culture in a way that promotes belonging. The other thing that happens is you empower everyone there to speak for and explore in a curious way what creates the conditions of belonging for everyone. So you share the task when you ask the question in a room.